Hello, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Faculty Lecture Committee, I'd like to welcome you all to this week's talk in the Spring 2024 Faculty Lecture Series. As we begin, we first respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. As part of that commitment, I encourage you to visit the tribe's FAQ website to learn more about their history and to donate to their cultural center. Before I introduce this week's speaker, I'd also like to say a word about this series for any first-time attendees. The Faculty Lecture Series was founded in 1911 by Catherine Mariotti Pratt, the spouse of a faculty member who wanted to, quote, relieve the tedium of long New England winters with an opportunity to hear Williams professors talk about issues that really mattered to them. From this lighthearted beginning, the Faculty Lecture Series has become an important opportunity for tenured professors to share their latest research with the larger intellectual community of the college. After today's talk, I hope you will join us for a reception upstairs in the lobby area of the Williams College Museum of Art. And I hope you will also join us here for next week's talk, where Jose Constantine in Geosciences will speak about a journey through the historical impacts and modern challenges that face tropical river ecosystems. Today, we will be hearing from Professor Sarah Olsen, Associate Professor in Classics. Sarah earned her master's and PhD in classics from UC Berkeley, and her work focuses on literature and performance in ancient Greece. She has published numerous articles and book chapters on dance in ancient Greece, as well as a recent monograph, Solo Dance in Archaic and Classical Greek Literature, representing the unruly body. She has also served as an editor for 2 recent volumes on imprints of dance in Greek and Roman antiquity, and Queer Euripides, Rereadings in Greek Tragedy. Currently, she is writing a book with Cambridge University Press entitled The Intimacy of Euripidean Tragedy, and that work will form the basis of what she'll talk to us about today. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Olsen.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that introduction. I will be talking about an ancient Greek text today, and I will have English text and transliteration up on the PowerPoint. But if anybody would like the ancient Greek texts, I do have a handout with those. I see one hand over there. Maybe Liz, I'll give these to you. And if anybody else would like some, you can be in charge of sharing them. All right. Thank you so much. So, if you know one story from ancient Greek myth, it may well be the story of Helen. Taken from her native Sparta by the Trojan prince Paris, willingly or by force, pick your preferred version, she provides a catalyst for the Trojan War, the devastating conflict between the allied Greeks and their eastern enemies, recounted in Homer's Iliad and refigured in many forms of Greek art and literature thereafter. For both ancient and modern audiences, it is the very familiarity of this story that makes it so compelling. Helen has been both victim and villain, an object of praise and blame, from her earliest appearances in Greek myth. She can be endlessly critiqued, reclaimed, and refigured. In fact, there's one ancient version of this myth in which Helen never went to Troy at all. According to both the poet Stesichorus and the historian Herodotus, she may instead have spent the entire war in Egypt, while the Greeks and Trojans fought over a mere image, an eidolon of her. This is the story dramatized by Euripides Helen, a play first produced in 412 BCE. The action takes place after the fall of Troy as the Greek commander Menelaus, Helen's husband, is attempting to make his way home to Sparta. When he is shipwrecked in Egypt, he is surprised to discover that his wife has been there safe and sound all along. Now, Helen has been under the protection of the Egyptian king Proteus. But when the play begins, Proteus has died. His son, Theoclymenus, now wants to marry Helen himself. Over the course of the play, Menelaus and Helen will reunite and choreograph a successful escape from Egypt and Theoclymenus. The play ends with the Deus Ex Machina appearance of Helen's brothers Castor and Pollux, who promise that Helen will return safely to Sparta. Euripides Helen is thus a play that dramatizes marital restoration. For this reason, I think it's productive to consider it in relation to the concept of the marriage plot, That is, a narrative structure organized around the courtship and eventual marriage of a man and a woman, with characterization and complications to the plot largely animated by this romantic orientation. Evident in novels and plays from the ancient world to the modern day, this narrative pattern has probably been most extensively theorized in relation to 18th and 19th century European and American novels. Euripides Helen, which, as I've mentioned, is organized around Helen's efforts to reunite with her husband Menelaus and return to Sparta, offers a kind of remarriage plot, wherein the tropes of courtship and marriage are used to reinstate Helen's temporarily disrupted marital identity. As Helena Foley has argued, this play stages the experience of a married, yet simultaneously young and virginal woman who is forcibly removed from her private domestic world, but finally achieves a reunion or symbolic remarriage with her spouse. Now, scholarly readings of both novelistic and dramatic marriage plots tend to balance teleology, that is, marriage's culmination, with careful attention to all that happens along the way. For many readers, deviations prove to be as important as dominant plots. In the last 40 years, queer literary studies has emerged as a field particularly attuned to the workings of alternative and suppressed narratives, a way, we might say, of centering the loose threads and dead ends embedded within familiar stories about human life cycles and desires. I'm going to return in the final portion of my talk today to some of this theoretical and interdisciplinary work, and explain how I see it as offering valuable insight for the analysis of Greek tragedy. For now, I'll simply note that this research provides me with a useful prompt to pay attention to a minor character in Euripides Helen, the maiden seer Theonoe. Theonoe is the daughter of Proteus, the sister of Theoclymenus, and as we learn at the outset of the play, she is both a prophet and a sworn virgin. She appears only once on stage near the midpoint of the play. In this scene, which will be the focus of my discussion today, Helen and Menelaus beg Theonoe to help them escape from Theoclymenus. In this sense, she is an important adjunct to the play's remarriage plot, but she is an adjunct nonetheless. As a woman committed to lifelong virginity, she lacks the potential for her own marriage plot. She is, in this sense, a narrative dead end. I'd like to suggest that the relationship between Helen and Theonoe, as it emerges in this scene, works to support the reunion of Helen and Menelaus, while also exposing the divergent femininities embodied by the two women. Ultimately, Theonoe, the virgin priestess, plays a crucial role in facilitating the restoration of Helen's marriage, even as her own words and actions underscore her distinctive claim to a womanhood unmarked by marriage and reproduction. This play undoubtedly valorizes marital reunion. Indeed, it's an odd sort of tragedy, with its seemingly happy ending and madcap escape plot. Yet through the representation of Theonoe, Euripides opens up an imaginative vista onto a different kind of womanhood. As I mentioned, Helen's exchange with Theonoe occurs about halfway through the play. By this point, Helen and Menelaus have been reunited and are attempting to escape from Egypt, and Theonoe's brother, Theoclymenus, who, as I mentioned before, wants to have Helen for himself. Helen and Menelaus realize that they need Theonoe's help, and they make a paired set of speeches arguing their case before her. She then responds and departs, never to appear again on stage. Helen frames her appeal to Theonoe as an act of supplication. "O maiden," Greek Parthenos, she says, "as a suppliant I fall about your knees." As we'll see, Helen seeks to persuade Theonoe that helping Helen and Menelaus is consistent with Theonoe's peculiar position as a virgin seer, a role that grants her unique flexibility in relation to the social and familial obligations normatively assigned to women. Helen's emphasis on Theonoe's status as Parthenos is a crucial element of this strategy, but it also develops in more complex and subtle ways over the course of her speech. So let's look at a few of the key moments. Helen begins by begging Theonoe to help her and this man, whom I, having just recently recovered, am on the verge of seeing die, and adds that this man, my husband, has come, most beloved, into my hands. While Helen's superlative affection, Greek philtaton, for her spouse reflects and reinforces her status as a married woman, she immediately maps out an alternative path for Theonoe, as she declares, But for the sake of your brother, do not betray the piety you once had, purchasing base and unjust favors. The Greek term sungonos, sibling or brother, foregrounds the genealogical link between Theonoe and her brother Theoclymenus. They share in, sun, their birth, their family, gonos. Yet the following line peels them apart, referring only to Theonoe herself and her piety or reverence, eusebia. Helen goes on to suggest that Theonoe's relationship to her brother is essentially transactional. That is, that if she were to inform him of Menelaus' presence, she would be purchasing base and unjust favors. The qualities of this imagined transaction are worth exploring further. As many scholars have observed, a pervasive contrast between gift exchange and commercial commodity exchange is evident across archaic and classical Greek thought. We generally find that aristocratic networks built upon hospitality, the exchange of gifts, and marriage bonds are privileged over more direct forms of commodity exchange and trade in the Greek literary and cultural imagination. Helen's phrasing here exploits this opposition. She warns Theonoe against swapping favors, charitas, using a term, charis, associated with the world of elite, non-monetary exchange. Yet the promise embedded in the word charis is tainted as the line goes on. These favors are base, even worthless, poneras, unjust, adikus, and available for purchase, onumene. Helen encourages Theonoe to repudiate her relationship with Theoclymenus by constructing it as transactional, in the most negative sense. Helen employs the language of value in exchange to opposite effect, however, when she describes Theonoe's obligations to her father, Proteus. Here, she reminds Theonoe that Hermes gave me to your father to keep safe for my husband, for this man who is at hand and wishes to have me back. In these lines, Helen evokes a system of nuptial exchange in which the bride is transferred from the father to the husband. This system, however, is explicitly non-monetary, a fact underscored by her use of the verb to give, edoke. Bridal transactions in Greek aristocratic thought belong to the realm of gift exchange. Helen also elides both of her own alleged fathers, Tyndareus and Zeus, mentioning only the god Hermes as the agent of the exchange. She's thus able to emphasize how Theonoe's father has taken on the structural role of Helen's father, keeping or preserving her for her husband. Helen then urges Theonoe to honor her father rather than her brother. She says, "You should not, then, respect a worthless brother more than a worthy father. And if, although you are a seer and have knowledge of divine things, you will destroy the justice of your father, and you will do a favor to your unjust brother, it is shameful that you know all divine matters and the things that are and will be, but you do not know what is just." Here, Helen figures Proteus and Theoclymenus as men with competing claims to Theonoe's loyalty and sense of duty, and aligns Proteus with justice and value, in contrast to Theoclymenus's worthless and unjust demands. Now, since Helen's goal is to persuade Theonoe to mislead, at least by omission, her brother, it's entirely reasonable that she would denigrate Theoclymenus and encourage Theonoe to distance herself from him. But I'd like to suggest that Helen is further linking Theonoe's ties to her father with her status as a virgin seer, a status that allows her to navigate the landscape of marital exchange and familial relations in distinctive ways. In the passage that I just quoted, the one that's up here right now, Helen links Theonoe's identity with her duty to honor her father's commitments. She suggests that if Theonoe is truly Theonoe, that is, a woman who knows, noe, divine things, Theo, then it would be shameful for her to grant favors to her brother instead of preserving the justice of her father. Helen's challenge to Theonoe recalls something that Helen made clear at the beginning of the play. Theonoe was not always Theonoe. In her opening monologue, Helen explains that Theonoe's mother, Psamathe, bore two children, Theoclymenus and a well-born maiden, her mother's glory, known as Ido when she was a child. But when she came to maturity, to the season for marriage, they called her Theonoe, for she knew all the divine things that are and will be, having received this honor from her grandfather Nereus. The name Theonoe thus refers to the revelation of the girl's prophetic powers and coincides with her divergence from a normative nuptial path. The child Ido, moreover, is linked with her mother, while the virgin prophetess Theonoe is associated more closely with a male ancestor, Nereus. When Helen urges Theonoe to honor her identity as Theonoe, as a seer, she's thus reminding her that this name and role have set her apart from the usual models of female maturity. But the name Theonoe has another resonance as well. In Plato's Cratylus, Socrates offers an etymology of the name Athena, as described from a description of the goddess as ha Theonoa, the woman who knows the mind of God. And he further explains that Homer might have called Athena Theonoe on the grounds that she has knowledge of divine things. Now, while Plato's dialogue is later than Euripides' Helen, it nonetheless establishes a possible link in the classical Greek imagination between this name and the goddess Athena. In addition, Euripides in this play refers to both Theonoe and Athena simply as Parthenos, maiden or virgin, a noun that often functions as essentially an epithet for Athena. Now, like Theonoe in this play, the goddess Athena is a sworn virgin with a close connection to her father, Zeus. Born from her father's head following his consumption of her mother, Metis, the playwright Aeschylus famously has Athena declare, "For there is no mother who gave birth to me, and with the exception of marriage, I praise the male in all things, with my whole heart, and I very much belong to my father." Indeed, while modern reception likes to cast Athena as a feminist warrior, classical scholarship has long stressed the ways in which she, from her unique position as a virgin goddess, safeguards the patriarchal order established by Zeus. This is worth keeping in mind as we look to the end of Helen's appeal, where she says, "Indeed, maiden, I make this supplication to you. Grant me this favor and imitate the ways of your just father." Helen's repetition of the term Parthenos and reminder of her suppliant stance underscores once more how she has entwined herself with Theonoe, even as she insists upon the distinctions that divide them. Theonoe is a sworn virgin, Helen is a devoted wife. But Helen now adds that Theonoe must not merely honor her father, but imitate his ways or manners, making herself more like him. For Helen's purposes, there is one crucial way in which Theonoe must become like Proteus. She must take on his obligation to protect Helen and eventually return her to Menelaus. As I mentioned before, Helen makes this obligation clear when she reminds Theonoe that Hermes gave me to your father to keep safe for my husband. Since Proteus has died, Helen asks Theonoe to embrace her position as a sworn virgin, attached to her father rather than a husband or brother, and perform her father's duties in his stead. Helen further frames this as a gift or favor, charin, to herself, the language of giving and charis gesturing back to our earlier discussion of worthwhile exchange. She wants Theonoe to grant her a favor by giving her back in marriage to Menelaus, and reminds her that such behavior would be an imitation of her just father. The counterpoint to her just father is, of course, her worthless and unjust brother, who's no longer mentioned. Helen has encouraged Theonoe to set aside her genealogical link to her brother and embrace her status as a sworn virgin in the mold of Athena, fully devoted to her father, and through that connection, able to take on roles and responsibilities otherwise unavailable to a woman. In this case, returning, even rebetrothing Helen to Menelaus. As a perpetual Parthenos, Theonoe represents an alternative to the life of marriage and reproduction that this play valorizes through its representation and rehabilitation of Helen. Yet, far from subverting the system of nuptial exchange itself, Theonoe is meant to simply adopt another position within it, taking on the normatively masculine role of delivering the bride to her husband. On the one hand, Theonoe is set apart from the female life narrative of betrothal, marriage, and sexual reproduction, becoming a potential agent rather than object of exchange. Yet crucially, Theonoe is called upon to participate in, even affirm, Helen's own nuptial narrative. But what about Theonoe herself? After Menelaus makes his own appeal, characterized primarily by masculine bluster and empty threats, Theonoe agrees to help the couple and gives a brief speech explaining her decision. On the one hand, Theonoe echoes Helen's plea and its logic. At the outset, she declares, "I am by nature pious, and I wish to be, and I cherish myself, and I would not stain the glory of my father, nor would I grant a favor to my brother that would cause me to appear ill-famed." As we saw, Helen contrasts Proteus, Theonoe's father, with Theoclymenus, her brother, and encourages her to see her attachments to the former as precluding obligations to the latter. Here, Theonoe not only affirms her links with her father, she also picks up on the language of exchange and reciprocity previously used by Helen herself. For while Helen disparagingly aligned Theoclymenus with commercial forms of exchange, warning Theonoe against purchasing base and unjust favors from her brother, Theonoe now constructs her relationship with him as one of non-reciprocal generosity. As she later explains, "I am doing a service to him, although it does not seem so to him, if I make him holy in place of his impiousness." Theonoe will do well by her brother in helping Helen, even if he does not actually regard her actions as a favor. Her piety and reverence for her father supersedes any impulse to seek favor from her brother. Theonoe also accepts Helen's suggestion that she take on the role of Proteus in returning Helen to Menelaus. Indeed, she speaks directly to Menelaus when she says, "And as for the reproaches you made about my father's tomb, I agree. I would be doing wrong if I did not give her back. For that man, were he alive, would give her back to you to have, and you to her." Theonoe refers directly to the threats contained in Menelaus' speech, but she uses the logic of Helen's. It is her job to honor her father by performing his role. Theonoe even uses inclusive first-person plurals to indicate "I, we agree," and "I, we would be doing wrong." While the use of the first-person plural to refer to a single speaker is common in Greek tragedy, it also enables Theonoe here to collapse her perspective with that of her father, underscoring how her actions are undertaken in tandem with his model or memory. Theonoe further emphasizes Proteus's intent when she adds, "If that man were alive, he would give her back to you, and you to her." But since Proteus is dead, it is Theonoe who will take on this typically masculine role of arranging the rebetrothal and eventual remarriage of Helen and Menelaus. As I suggested before, the virgin daughter who enacts the will of the father recalls the role of the goddess Athena, as an ostensibly non-normative woman whose actions nevertheless uphold the patriarchal order. In this way, Theonoe fits nicely within Helen's carefully constructed drama of marital restoration. But I want to call attention to another curious feature of Theonoe's speech. In it, she twice promises, "I will try," and twice declares, "I will keep silent." So, for example, when she agrees to help Helen, she says, "So that I not expound at length, I will be silent about the requests you have made of me, and I will never be a co-conspirator in my brother's foolishness." Theonoe's emphasis on her own silence, segesomai, characterizes her role in the plot as one of concealment through omission. She will help Helen and Menelaus, but she will do so simply by keeping quiet, by refusing to inform her brother of Menelaus' presence, rather than taking any positive action on the couple's behalf. She repeats the same verb later when she says, "You yourselves," that is Helen and Menelaus, "find some path, while I, standing apart, out of the way, will keep silent." Theonoe also twice declares, "I will try," parasomai. The use of the future tense creates a parallel between her silence, "I will be quiet," segesomai, and her intended but as yet unrealized efforts, parasomai. First, she tells Menelaus, "I will try to preserve this honor or heritage that I have from Nereus." Shortly thereafter, she declares, "I will try to remain a virgin, Parthenos, always." The repetition of the word pairasomai underscores the link between these two actions. As we've seen, Theonoe's maidenly status is bound up with her relationship to her father. Yet her use of the verb pairao, to try or to attempt, introduces an unsettling degree of uncertainty. Theonoe will try to preserve the sense of justice she has inherited from Nereus and to remain a virgin forever, but the language of attempt opens up the potential for failure. Fidelity to the values of her father and grandfather and perpetual virginity would both seem to be core elements of Theonoe's character, yet here she introduces the possibility that she may not succeed in maintaining them. The projection of her efforts into the future intensifies this sense of uncertainty. She promises that she will be silent, she will try, but will that future come to pass? Theonoe, of course, is a seer, a figure uniquely capable of grasping the future. Earlier in the play, Helen asks Theonoe whether Menelaus is still alive and receives a true and encouraging answer. Yet here, Theonoe offers no predictions as to the success or failure of Helen and Menelaus' plot, nor does she even frame her own future in secure and certain terms. She simply declares her intention to try and keep quiet. This is a strangely tenuous way for Theonoe to figure her own position, and I think it's worth pondering further. Specifically, it's at this juncture that I would like to return to the idea of the marriage plot and its apparent dead ends. As I mentioned, scholars working within queer literary studies have been particularly attentive to the importance of unrealized futures, alternative subplots, and minor characters. In other words, the people, objects, and stories left out of dominant, normative, perhaps even happy narratives. That's not to say that all narrative deviation is necessarily socially or culturally deviant. Let's take female intimacy, the close relationships between women that span the continuum from kinship to friendship to eroticism. Adrienne Rich famously described the whole of this as the lesbian continuum and challenged readers and cultural critics alike to see the subversive potential in a wide range of female relations. There's a deeper well of scholarship that we could discuss here, of course, but it might be more helpful to observe that there's a real intimacy to Helen and Theonoe's interaction. As I mentioned before, Helen supplicates Theonoe, an act that often carries an erotic charge in ancient Greek literature. Indeed, supplication between women is comparatively rare in Greek tragedy. In fact, in extant Greek tragedy, it only occurs in Euripides. And it's all the more interesting here because the suppliant is Helen, who is elsewhere described and depicted as baring her breasts when she begs Menelaus to spare her. When in this play she falls about Theonoe's knees, I think we're invited to pay closer attention to the relationship being staged between these two women. But at the same time, I think some comparative reflection is in order. As Sharon Marcus has observed, female friendship in Victorian novels, a useful site for considering marriage plots, largely functions not as an obstacle to the marriage plot, but as a necessary component of it. She specifically argues that in 19th century British fiction, but perhaps also more broadly, female friendship was neither a static auxiliary to the marriage plot nor a symptomatic exclusion from it, but instead a transmission mechanism that kept narrative energies on track. I think that Marcus's analysis is quite valuable as a model for exploring how female intimacy, like its more widely discussed counterpart, male homosociality, can work to uphold rather than subvert normative structures of marriage, desire, and social order. As we've seen, Helen offers Theonoe a clear role within the nuptial drama, and her actions ultimately support the permanent reunion of Helen and Menelaus. In this respect, the exchange between the two women could be described, to borrow Marcus's words, as a transmission mechanism that succeeds in keeping the narrative energies of the marriage plot on track. At the same time, I want to hold on to the subversive or at least unsettling potential of female life set beyond the boundaries of marriage and reproduction, the potential embodied in this play by Theonoe. And in order to elucidate the importance of Theonoe as a model of alternative femininity, I think we need to turn to a different corpus of theoretical and comparative literary scholarship. In other words, I'd like to talk about spinsters. By this I mean an unmarried adult woman who is emphatically not a mother or wife, a figure important to both feminist and queer scholarship in a variety of ways. Now, I'll acknowledge up front that spinster is an anachronistic term to apply to a character in an ancient Greek tragedy. I believe, however, that many literary readings of the spinster have useful points of contact with the representation of Theonoe as virgin priestess. And that's what I'd like to delve into with the remainder of my time today. Since I won't have time to walk through all of the scholarship here, I'll note that I'm drawing particularly upon the work of Eve Sedgwick, Heather Love, our own Katie Kent here at Williams, Sarah Ensor, and Melissa Mueller. While most of these scholars focus on 19th and 20th century British and/or American culture, the context in which the term spinster itself, of course, has the greatest traction, Mueller's recent book provides a model for bringing this work into dialogue with ancient Greece. The spinster, for my purposes, is defined by her tenuous relationship to both the family and the future. She may be attached to a traditional kin structure. The spinster aunt is a popular figure in some literary genres, but she is not essential to it. And since she is both unmarried and does not reproduce, she does not directly contribute to the genealogical future of the family. To be a bit more culturally and historically specific, we might observe that both in the eras analyzed by the scholars I've mentioned here, and in the classical Greek world, womanhood is constructed in relation to marriage and reproduction. We can see this emerge quite clearly in Euripides Helen, when Helen expresses her desire to restore her relationship with Menelaus and return to Sparta in order, in turn, to secure a marriage for her daughter Hermione, who has been unable to marry because of the shameful absence of her mother. The reproduction of the family line into the future is the underlying goal. The spinster, however, is removed from this procreative labor. She may, through her attachments to a larger kinship structure, still participate in the care of the family, what Ensor calls tending the future, but she does so from what Mueller describes as an oblique angle. Looking back at Theonoe's own words, we might notice how she tells Helen and Menelaus, "You yourselves find some path, while I, standing apart, out of the way, will keep silent." The structure of her words juxtaposes Helen and Menelaus at the start of one line, with Theonoe herself at the start of the next, and this contrast is underscored by the use of the Greek particles men, de. Theonoe distinguishes herself from the couple even as she agrees to help them. This approach corresponds with her status as a committed parthenos, a woman, a spinster, separated from the normative processes of marriage and reproduction. Through silence and both physical and figurative distance, she positions herself at an oblique angle to the couple and their values, not opposed and perhaps even supportive, but still fundamentally removed. In addition, ancient Greek parthenia, or maidenhood, was a conceptually short-lived state, the season of a young woman's life that precedes marriage and motherhood, represented specifically as a prelude to adult female life. That is, lifelong ritual or religious virginity was not a historical practice in Euripides' Athens, nor was it really a mythic narrative available to mortal women, right, as opposed to goddesses. By describing Theonoe as a spinster, I'm also trying to call attention to the strange temporality of her parthenaic womanhood, the way she lingers in the transition between girl and woman. I think this aspect of Theonoe's identity can help to make sense of her repeated use of the future tense. By this, I mean that Theonoe's words underscore the suspended futurity embodied by the perpetual Parthenos. As we've seen, Theonoe's response to Helen is characterized by distance and silence, a kind of action through non-action. She will withdraw, keep herself apart from the escape plot, and she will aid Helen and Menelaus by keeping quiet. She provides just enough help to allow the narrative to move forward, but no more. We might further observe, in fact, that Euripides does not dramatize any future at all for Theonoe. When Helen's brothers, Castor and Pollux, appear at the end of the play, they prevent Theoclymenus from killing Theonoe and promise marital restoration to Helen and Menelaus. But they do not chart out a future for the play's Egyptian characters. Theonoe's future beyond the play comes into view only through her own words. "I will attempt to remain a Parthenos forever," the adverb aie, always or forever, offers a single gesture toward the remainder of Theonoe's life. The sense of permanence and endurance implied by aie, always, stands in tension with the tenuous futurity of perasumai, I will try. I think this verbal dissonance reflects the queer status of sworn virgins and spinsters alike, as women for whom the future will not proceed through a normative process of generation and procreation. Helen, in her speech, narrates the Parthenos in a way that offers her a legible position within the marital and reproductive economy. By arguing that Theonoe can and should adopt the responsibilities of her father and give Helen back to Menelaus in remarriage, Helen grants Theonoe a role in the pursuit of marital productivity. Theonoe agrees to Helen's plea, but she figures her own role in decidedly different terms. By stressing the uncertainty of her own future and describing her role as one of silence and withdrawal, Theonoe calls attention to how the Parthenos, or spinster, is poised outside of the expected patterns of female life. As a normatively transitory state, maidenhood is often figured as precarious in the Greek literary and cultural imagination, a particularly vulnerable moment in the female life cycle. Insofar as the perpetual Parthenos lingers within that precarity, her life may well be described as one she will try to live, balanced on the precipice of the future she has refused. If there is something tragic about this uncertainty, the sense that Theonoe's future is already foreclosed, limited, or shunted to the side, then perhaps it is something akin to the melancholy that Heather Love attributes to the spinster and her various fellow travelers in the history of queer life. A recognition of, and I quote, the ache of standing outside of things rather than in the midst of them. So to conclude, my reading today has participated in a tradition that takes Euripides' representations of femininity quite seriously. Even though these plays were performed by exclusively male actors, likely for an all-male audience, it seems to me too easy, too simplistic, to dismiss them as just so much patriarchal propaganda. As Victoria Wohl has argued, and I'm going to read this out because I think it's really valuable. The moments in which tragedy offers alternatives to its patriarchal structures are fragile and fleeting, almost imperceptible. And they are always repressed, prevented from having lasting effects or from derailing the anticipated resolution. But if they cannot forestall the gentlemen's agreements that close these plays, they do subvert the closure these transactions should bring. For the alternatives eliminated do not evanesce, but rather persist in a sense of unease, a sense of misgiving, a particularly tragic suspicion that full and certain truth has eluded us at the end. As we've seen, Theonoe's alternative womanhood is both fragile and fleeting. Her perpetual partheneia, I will try to be a Parthenos always, is perhaps paradoxically ephemeral. Her appearance in this play is brief, and she has no extant mythic afterlife. But I'd like to suggest that the power of Theonoe's position lies in its very precarity. We can certainly read Euripides Helen as a drama or even a comedy of remarriage, and focus on how Helen herself is rehabilitated from the perspective of normative Greek values. But if we attend instead to Theonoe, we are invited to think about what it would mean for a woman to inhabit a space beyond the marital frameworks celebrated by the dominant narrative arc. Helen's marital triumph, after all, is likewise fleeting. When the play ends, it becomes just another one of the many images that make up the ever-shifting constellation of Helen. Indeed, it's the loose threads and dead ends of Greek myth, the minor characters, the alternate storylines, that provide rich creative fodder for contemporary novelists, poets, and playwrights. We might think of Madeline Miller's Circe or Anne Carson's Norma Jean Baker of Troy. To my knowledge, Theonoe has yet to receive her own imaginative retelling. Unlike Helen, her appearance in this play is singular. But perhaps the reinvention of Theonoe is overdue. Thank you.
Sarah, will you be willing to entertain
Of course. Thank you.
Do you need a moderator, or would you like
I'm I'm happy to moderate myself, yeah.
Can I ask about the idea of trying to stay Parthenos? Is that something that would be internally difficult, or something that would be, I should be thinking about it as being externally difficult? Something that society is pushing against, or something that internally would be challenging?
That's a really good question. I think it's both. I mean, I think it's, on the one hand, Theonoe, in this play, if we think about Theonoe specifically, she has this clear structural role, right, that allows her lifelong virginity, at least within this mythic universe, right? It seems to go together. But again, she's vulnerable in other ways to her brother, right? It's only the intervention of these demigod figures at the end that keep him from killing her. So in that, as a woman, there's a sort of constant threat of sexual violence, right? The sense that her position socially, physically within this world means that permanent virginity is always, for her to maintain the status, is always going to be at somebody else's whim, right? Or is going to be vulnerable. But I think the other possibility, right, the internal pressure that you mentioned is maybe even more interesting, right? Because it opens up the idea that Theonoe has an internal life, right? What if, and again, she's a character in this play, but I think this is what we're invited to imagine. What if she didn't want to be a virgin? What if she had a partner that she did want to be? What would that look like, right? What are the desires or the possibilities or the futures that are being foreclosed for this character? And I think the one, right, the ways that to try to always be a virgin is dependent on external pressures says a lot about Greek society and its structures broadly. But the other half, right, what does it mean for her personally, I think is also part of what Euripides is inviting us to ponder. Thank you. Yeah, again.
Thank you. This is really fascinating, and I'm interested in Helen's somewhat paradoxical situation in this with regard to virginity. Very early on in your talk, you mentioned the fact that she's put backwards, so to speak, in the marriage plot to the status of the virgin before marriage, even though she's already been married, so it's a remarriage plot. And I'm thinking about, I'm wondering if there's a way in which Theonoe's, her role illuminates the sort of both double vulnerability and the double mandate for women to be a virgin, but also to be married.
Yeah.
And how I mean, of course, I'm thinking, Chris knows, of a German story that I've spent basically my life's work of someone else who is pregnant without her knowledge, and this whole tension between knowing and not knowing, being known and not being known. And I'm wondering if that's another way in which Theonoe is functioning to open up possibilities even within somebody as central as Helen.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I think that's right. And I think I maybe haven't done Helen justice in this talk. I sort of I make Helen a little bit of the foil to Theonoe by, in talking about her, the way she is rehabilitated and the ways that she orchestrates this remarriage, which is, I would say true. But this is a play that is so centrally about doubling, right? There are two Helens. There's Helen there's the image that went to Troy, there's the real Helen is here in Egypt. This is a different Helen than the Helen we have encountered even in other plays of Euripides. And there's also a way that Helen and Theonoe are doubles for each other, just as you're saying. So this, let me find it. So this Theonoe's first name, Ido, right? The Helen that went to Troy is the Eidolon, the image. So there's through this name already a kind of doubling of these alternative selves that both of these women have. And that, right, the Eidolon, the image, the sort of alternative phantom of Helen, is, I think, as you're pointing to, all about knowledge, right? Which in Greek thought is very closely related to vision and seeing, right? To know is to see is to know is to see. And so, right, how do we identify Helen, right? We had a false Helen. Our knowledge of her was wrong. And so I think this is a great point, and very true with both of these women. We're invited to think about how they double for each other, how they each have their own kind of alternate doubles, and how do we as audience members decide what's true, right? How do we know, what would it be to know either of these characters? I think Magnus and then Liz.
Sort of related to this theme we're just talking about, and that you ended up talking about projecting the future. I wonder if you could go into the slide just before this one. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's where you're talking about being a seer, but at the same time not being just. Because in other maybe stories, or when you think about prophets, usually prophets are just.
Yeah.
And where is her unjustness related in the fact that she is rejecting the future in a way, or how is that related to this notion of being unjust and maybe rejecting the future, yet still knowing it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting. What's implied here is the idea that she could be unjust, but still be a seer, right? She would still have that knowledge of Theia. And Helen, right, is portraying this as a great crime were she to do this, right? To say, if you have divine knowledge, if you're a seer, you should be just, right? You should reject your brother. But I think this is another really fascinating hypothetical to ponder, right? Is what would it mean for her to act unjustly, yet retain that knowledge, right? To know and not to do good. I mean, we're getting, we could get very Socratic or Platonic here about the, right? What is it? If you know what is good, do you do what is good? But there's a lot of that kind of philosophical debate is also at stake in this play. So I think that's, the idea that question is being posed to us here. On the other hand, rhetoric is another important part of this play. And Helen is making this argument, right, that it would be unjust. There could be another perspective, right, that actually for Helen or for Theonoe to honor her brother is the just thing. That is what she should do. So I think we do need to see this as kind of Helen's rhetorical sleight of hand or her argument. There could be others.
Sarah, thank you so much. Everything is spinning in my head thinking about this incredible pivot that in the plot that depends on this passive character, or this character going passive. Yeah. And so she can't act against her brother. I mean, she can't inform her brother, even though her brother is in the place of her father, because her father is dead, and so it's he's now the dominant male in the family structure, and she has to answer to him. But I wanted to go back to Lara's question, and we're to that. I will try to be a virgin forever. I will try to do it, and I don't think it's dependent necessarily on her willpower, but I think that it's a kind of humility, because as you said, that it's only goddesses that can remain virgins forever, like Hestia or Athena. So here she is. If Helen is a kind of mortal reflection of Aphrodite, here you have Theonoe as a even in her name with those mixed up letters being a reflection, or pale mortal reflection of Athena herself. But she can't say, I will remain a virgin forever, because that would be really hubristic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? That it's the sort of mortal humility, right? I will try, I will. But I also love the way you first said it. I will try. I think that it reminds, right? This is theater. This is a play. How much of a difference would intonation make, right? Intonation, acting, gesture. This could be played a lot of different ways that would really change how we interact with Theonoe. And I'm less interested generally in trying to get back to 412 BC in the spring, how Euripides' original actors played it, because I think we just can't know. But think that Euripides as playwright, right, is already cognizant of creating a script that has potential embedded in it. And we can read it, even now as readers thousands of years later, right, we can read it with an eye to those potentialities.
Thank you. Steve?
I have a question that's a little bit off the central line of thought of your talk, and it's also based on the fact that I haven't read Euripides Helen, but you referred a number of times to the structure of remarriage comedy, and a common feature of that structure is that in the initial marriage, obstacles between the partners emerge, causing the breach, and that the remarriage is about overcoming those obstacles. So that is something I recognize from the most familiar version of the Menelaus and Helen story that I frequently, that comes into my teaching frequently, is in the Odyssey, and when Telemachus visits Menelaus, and you can really feel the pressure that there are things to work out there that are kind of not quite being worked out. So this is all a background to asking, since I don't know the play. Does Menelaus know which Helen he's remarrying? And does that shed any light on what there is to be worked out?
Well, so he thinks he got Helen back in Troy. The Eidolon is still, there. He thinks, and we don't, should we imagine what happened prior to this play as matching, let's say, Euripides' Trojan Women, right, which is Euripides' play that dramatizes some of that? Maybe, but these plays weren't performed together. They weren't, and then, or should we imagine, the sort of the way we get Helen in the Iliad or in Homeric poetry? I think all of those, right, all of those possible Helens, but are in play. But Menelaus thinks he's got a Helen with him. He thinks he is the Helen when he lands in Egypt, and it's only when he encounters, right, this other Helen, and the Eidolon vanishes. It's like once he's found, then that other one. So there's a way that, through the drama of this play, this Helen, right, the one we're meeting, who's been in Egypt all along, is presented to us as the real one, and to Menelaus. And they're, represented as right, getting back together. But the Odyssey parallel is, I think, a really helpful one to keep. Again, which would have been in the minds of Euripides' audience, right? They would have known Homer. It's hard to imagine this is a happy marriage in the end, right? Or that this is a happy ending. These characters are negotiating around each other in many ways in this scene, and just for the sake of time and clarity, I didn't really spend a lot of time or much time at all on Menelaus' speech, which comes in between Helen and Theonoe's, Helen's speech and Theonoe's response. But in a lot of ways, I think he's just blustering and threatening and entirely missing the conversation that's happening between Helen and Theonoe. So there's still a little bit of that Menelaus who just doesn't quite get it all.
Thank you. I'm interested to know what other female characters like Theonoe you're pursuing for this book project, because I'm guessing that there are some other ones. And anyway, interested if you could talk about one or two of them.
Yeah. So I'm interested, right, in this project in moments of intimacy between women, between female characters, moments like this one where there's two female figures who are being, in most cases, staged in proximity to one another, interacting closely. So in addition to this scene, another scene of supplication that I'm really interested in, very interested in supplication in general, right? Supplication between women as a kind of pointed form of staging in Euripides, one that's calling our attention to these kinds of moments. And in Euripides' Andromache, another Trojan War aftermath play, Andromache, who's the Trojan princess, wife of Hector. Hector's dead, her son Astyanax is dead, she's now married to Achilles' son Neoptolemus, but that play is all structured around her kind of supplication and taking refuge at a statue of the goddess Thetis. Thetis then appears at the end of the play as a kind of Deus Machina character. But prior to that, Andromache describes herself embracing the statue, supplicating the statue, right at this moment that Andromache imagines that she might die and melt away and kind of cease from this repetitive process, which for Andromache is really pointed of marriage and reproduction, right? Marriage, reproduction, and then loss. Loss of the husband, loss of the child. But then again, pairing and reproduction. So that's another important moment of supplication. I'm also very interested in mother-daughter relations. So in Euripides' Phoenician Women, which is one of the plays where we get his kind of take on the Oedipus myth. And so we have Jocasta and Antigone, but also Hecuba, another Trojan War play. This originally started out as Trojan War plays, and then it expanded. But where we have Hecuba, the Trojan queen, bidding farewell to her daughter Polyxena, who's going to be sacrificed.
And just to follow up one thing, is supplication between women particularly interesting because of the power dynamic? Men versus women. Women are generally not the ones who can, with very rare exceptions like Euripides and the Odyssey.
Yes.
They don't really often have the authority to grant you what you want. Is that one of the
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I think supplication between women is interesting because supplication implies this power dynamic, right? A less powerful character seeking aid. And so it is rarely women, and this example of Euripides from the Odyssey I think is exactly right as an important exception. It's rarely women, right? Maybe goddesses, right? Or statues as avatars of goddesses. But also because supplication so often in Greek poetry, it does have an erotic charge as well. It is this kind of act of seduction and I mean, Helen is the kind of classic example of this. Helen supplicating Menelaus is very much a kind of act of sexual seduction. But when it's a woman supplicating a man, that dynamic is often there. But so then what happens when it's a woman to a woman? And it does only happen in Euripides. I mean, we don't have there's so much Greek tragedy we don't have that any claim like that has to be tempered. But, I think it is. Sorry, there's another hand. Yeah.
Like a minor tale of that. Yeah. Do men ever supplicate women? Or like female goddesses or anything? Is there any context in which you might see that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember all the examples. I should have come ready with all my examples to know if it's, goddesses. I mean, Euripides in the Odyssey, so it's not a tragedy example. Again, where she's the queen, so she has this distinctive power.
It's also an inverted kind of social order.
Yes, yeah, true, for the Odyssey as well, yeah. Yeah, I know I have to think about that. I mean, I'm not thinking of something right off the top of my head, which means, something, but I don't want to say, Yeah.
Well, that was the question I was going to ask, actually, of like, if you're looking at that, the flip side of men supplicating to women, if I'm not mistaken, Odysseus and Nausicaa.
Oh, that's another Odysseus and Nausicaa. Yes, the way he approaches her, and that's actually such a great example of the kind of vulnerability of the maiden, right? That's a scene where you have this scary guy who's washed up on the sea. Who is he? Where is he coming from? He's naked. He's and this young maiden who Jonathan knows from being in enough Greek classes with me is out doing the most dangerous thing a girl can do in Greek literature and myth, right? She's out frolicking by the sea with her friends. And this is always when a god comes and snatches you away. So here's Nausicaa, right? It's the ominous music would be playing in the movie. And Odysseus appears, of course, he doesn't assault her. He, supplicates her, and he instead begs her to help him. But it's the inversion of what you might expect. And then and it's also, it's still seductive, right? It's still, I think that just...
Notice how he doesn't touch her. Remember, he
yes.
thinks somebody to touch her, and then, I'm not going to touch her. That wouldn't be quite right.
It wouldn't be right. And I'm not going to be seen going into the city with her, right? We're going to orchestrate this very carefully. But yes, you're right that it's not assault, right? But it's seduction. And I think if we think about seduction and supplication, the kind of seductive elements of supplication a little more broadly.
And you see kind of the inversion of that in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite.
Oh, yeah.
So Anchises first meets Aphrodite, and she's appearing in all her, beauty and dressed up like a young bride. He's like, "You've got to be a goddess," and also doesn't touch her. And then she's like, "Oh no, I've been brought here to be your bride." And it's like, "Okay, let's just take off this jewelry, this veil, this article of clothing one by one."
Yeah.
And then he's in that position of naked vulnerability once again at the very end.
Yeah.
When she reveals that she is a goddess.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's almost a comic inversion
Right.
of the Nausicaa.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it is, right? I mean, in part because, thinking back to the framing of that poem, right, this is meant to be a punishment for Aphrodite. It's not supposed to be, that she's fallen in love with a mortal man.
I was wondering if you flip it where theoretically you think about like Menelaus being the one to get remarried and Theoclymenus ending the play unmarried. Is there any way in which they are also kind of two alternate pathways of masculinity, or is that division mostly just present with Helen and Theonoe?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a good question. I think that's another doubling, right? It's the sort of two marital paths not taken, the partner she does end up with and this other, and the Greek hero, right, and the Egyptian villain, Theoclymenus as the kind of villain of this play, the bad guy, in Egypt, right, not Greece, the foreigner. And I think it's relevant too, right, that we don't get a future for him either. He is also kind of left. That whole world just kind of vanishes once Helen and Menelaus sail away. So I think that's a useful way to think about it as well, yeah. And your comment also made me think that, to the supplication question, Menelaus is very emphatic in his speech that he is not going to supplicate Theonoe. That is not, appropriate. It is not how he's going, right? His approach, he is not showing her that kind of reverence. So that, to maybe some of the gender and social dynamics of supplication, that's probably relevant.
So this is super cool, and I'll have to bug you with lots of questions when we run into each other on the road. But I'm curious about the role of other people's perception, because I noticed in your thing where Theonoe is talking about why she wants to do the good thing. Part of that is about other people's perception of her. She doesn't want to be ill-famed or whatever. Yeah. So I wonder, to what extent other people's perception is playing a role in agency or lack of agency on their part, and her part specifically.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question again for a play, right? Is there a kind of meta-theatrical element to that? This is all about how somebody else is perceiving you, right? We're all playing roles. One thing I think is really interesting about this phrase, and it's, maybe not quite, or these lines, right, where Theonoe sort of starts out and asserts her position. It's a little more stark in my translation here than it is in the Greek. It runs over the line in a slightly different way. But I am really struck by her I, like this first person singular. I am pious. I wish to be. I cherish myself. I will not stain. It's a very powerful first person active voice that's coming in here. So I think you're right that it's about reputation. I mean, she does care about how she's perceived, right? And how she's being seen by Helen. Most of all, right, this assertion is being made to Helen and Menelaus about who she is. But it's interesting that appear, and I realize I gave away all of my Greek handouts, so I could pull it up here, but it would take a while. To look at this again more closely in the Greek, but that it does, this emphasis on appearance and perception, right, comes in at the end after these pretty powerful statements of, I am this, right? It's not appearance, but I am. Again, in a play that I think is all about, right, reality and appearance.
Do you have a question back there? The classicists?
She's afraid to cross the hall for me, I can.
Okay. So if there are no further questions, can we please adjourn upstairs to the museum lobby where there are some light refreshments, and let's thank our speaker once again.
Thank you all. Thank you.